In 1929, after being expelled from the CPUSA, Lovestone created a new party called the Communist Party USA Majority. The original name for this group, which was most definitely not the majority, came from Lovestone's perception that before his forced expulsion, that 90% of the party stood behind him. In his and his followers' eyes, this new party, which was also not a new party, represented the true will of the American communist movement. Stalin's statement that the reason that the majority of the party stood behind Lovestone was because that they were under the impression that he had the trust and support of the Comintern, and in the event that this was no longer the case, that he would no longer have that support, proved to be quite true. In 1932, Lovestone's group, who were referred derogatorily as the Lovestoneites, renamed themselves to the Communist Party USA Opposition, or simply the Communist Party Opposition, CPO, and thus finally embraced the fact that they were in the minority. According to Bertram Wolfe in the first introduction to his pamphlet, What is the Communist Opposition?, the CPO was not a new party. He argued that there cannot at any point exist two communist parties, and that the stated goal of this group, at least in 1932, was solely to fight for its readmission into the party, and for its right to argue its views inside the party on the basis of democratic centralism. He also wrote that in principle, every segment of the communist movement, which, from his perspective, had been split into three parts, advocated for the same basic set of principles, those being support for the proletarian dictatorship, support for planned economy, and belief in the idea that there were no national communist party, but that each communist party was but one segment of the world communist movement. Wolfe and the Lovestoneites even advocated for the readmission of the Trotskyists into the Communist Party, where they would also be allowed to argue for their tactical views, but Wolfe stated that this readmission could only occur under the condition that the Trotskyists drop their Thermidor thesis and commit fully to the defense of the Soviet Union, which Wolfe deemed to be an authentic dictatorship of the proletariat. But this would never happen. The Lovestone group remained an outside force acting adjacent to and at times supporting the CPUSA, such as during their electoral campaigns in 1932 and 1936. Although this group was quite small, it was surprisingly quite influential in the American labor movement in the 1930s. In 1937, they would change their name to the Independent Communist League, and in 1938, they went by Independent Labor League of America, no longer associating themselves with the communist movement, even as an opposition trend. The main leaders of the Lovestone group were J. Lovestone, Bertram Wolfe, and Will Herberg. All three were Jewish, and in the future, they would all become virulent anti-communists. Lovestone was the leader. He was the head organizer of all the group's engagements with other organizations, such as the other communist opposition groups joined together in the International Communist Opposition, as well as non-communist labor organizations. He contributed to his group's newspaper, but didn't often talk about ideological issues related to Marxism-Leninism. He did debate Bertrand Russell in 1931. Wolfe, on the other hand, was the scholarly one amongst them. He was this group's intellectual and dealt with the theoretical questions of Marxism-Leninism. Prior to exiting the CPUSA, he organized the Workers' School, which was the party's educational institution. As a member of the CPO, he was the director of the new Workers' School, which had previously been called the Marx-Lenin School. As the group's head intellectual, he was greatly interested in art and often contributed cartoons to their weekly paper. He maintained a friendship with the Mexican Trotskyist Diego Rivera, who contributed a mural featuring Lovestone, James Cannon, and Edward Walsh, among others, to the CPO's party school in New York. Will Herberg was the youngest of the group's leadership. He worked as the editor of the CPO's newspaper and contributed articles on theory and economics, but also connected aspects of his faith to his writings. Also in Lovestone's group was a notable union activist named Charles S. Zimmerman, a veteran trade unionist from Scotland named Ellen Dawson, and African-American workers such as Edward Walsh, Grace Lamb, and Ernest Calloway. When the group split from the Comintern in 1929, there were 6 basic points of disagreement and criticisms which the Lovestone group had with the general, quote, Moscow line. According to Tim Davenport, who quotes Bertram Wolfe, the first problem was that Marxism, in their eyes, had begun to be treated by the official communists as, quote, ritualistic creed, a ready-made solution of all problems by means of a few cut-and-dried formulas. Second, the official communists began to substitute actual analysis for pseudo-revolutionary phrase-mongering and self-deception. The Lovestone group believed that the party had isolated itself with proposals and slogans that didn't conform with the actual situation present in the country. Third, they opposed the new dual unionism tactic, that is, those sectarian or red unions which the Comintern had encouraged communists in every country to create. Fourth, they took issue with the official communists' repudiation of the United Front tactic in favor of something they called the United Front from below, which, according to Bertram Wolfe, was, quote, only an invitation to non-party workers to support the party program, and did not actually involve any sort of united front. Fifth, they felt the party was violating the principles of democratic centralism and killing actual democracy and discussion in the party. Lastly, they took issue with the charges of exceptionalism being levied against them. When Lovestone was kicked out of the party, one of the reasons he was removed was for supposedly propagating a theory of American exceptionalism. Basically, it was argued that Lovestone proposed the USA was a unique entity that existed beyond the, quote, Marxist laws of history, that American capitalism was a different type of capitalism and therefore required different tactics from the rest of the world. This allegation has been repeated for a century and is tied greatly to his name, but upon further scrutiny, this claim is rather blown out of proportion. The course of the story is as such. When the Comintern entered the third period, it started preaching about the final collapse of capitalism, albeit at the time there was no evidence of this. Later, the Great Depression occurred, which seemingly confirmed this view, but at the time, when Lovestone was vehemently opposed to the new turn in strategy, there was no obvious evidence of this supposed collapse. Lovestone never argued that American capitalism was exceptional, but rather that capitalism itself was different in various segments of the world. Therefore, each party needed to make use of the proper tactics that suited the situation occurring in this or that nation. Bertram Wolfe writes, the American Communist opposition is denounced as American exceptionalists. If we understand what the party leaders are driving at, we plead guilty to the charge. Yes, we consider that the conditions in America are different from conditions in Germany, or Spain, or the Soviet Union. We are more than American exceptionalists. We are exceptionalists for every country of the world, and in pleading guilty to considering the conditions of each country different from those of the rest, peculiar, exceptional, we are in good company, the company of Marx and Lenin. The fundamental aims of the communist movement are the same throughout the world: the overthrow of capitalism, the establishment of Soviet power, the building of a socialist society. But the methods of reaching that goal, the tactics to be applied at a given moment, are different for each country and even for each stage of the struggle in a given country. Neither Lovestone nor his followers saw the USA as a unique entity, or rather, a specific one, which required specific tactics, and that the Comintern's universalizing of sectarian tactics was a foolish endeavor. In the previous statement, they echo somewhat, but also quote Lenin's polemic with the European left communists in 1920, who ironically argued the same thing as Lovestone in their defense against Lenin's attacks, about how their situation was different from the Russian one. Thus, they could not just simply transport Russian tactics over to Western Europe. In fact, the Communist Party opposition's opposition to Stalin was only an opposition to the tactics which he was pushing on the American communists. Lovestone himself and most members of his group did not oppose any of Stalin's policy in the Soviet Union. When he enacted the collectivization campaigns, the so-called revolution from above, Lovestone welcomed it. In their newspaper, they gave grand praise to the 5-year plan and its achievements, but one of the members and a longtime ally of Lovestone, Ben Gitlow, had relatives in the USSR and was receiving contrary information. His frustrations with Lovestone's continued praise of the rapid industrialization plan caused him to leave the group, but he was an exception. The Lovestoneites practically supported everything about the Soviet Union. They praised its economic policy, its foreign policy, and extolled the so-called democracy pushed by the 1930s Stalin Constitution, the most democratic constitution in the world. As much as they opposed the Comintern's tactics, they very rarely attacked Stalin. Even in 1936, when the Great Purge was ongoing, Lovestone's group completely supported the trials. They completely accepted the guilty pleas of Zinoviev and Kamenev, and although Lovestone was against their execution, he believed that they would only represent a bump in the log of history. It was only when Bukharin was put on the chopping block that Lovestone began to reconsider his view of the purges. The group would drop communist from its name only a few months after Bukharin was executed, but it was only after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that the Lovestoneites would completely disavow the Comintern and the Soviet Union. The Lovestone group had members and local affiliates all across the nation, but never did they come close to ever being larger than the official Communist Party. Ben Gitlow would write, quote, "We had fully 4/5 of the Communist Party membership with us when we were its acknowledged leaders, yet hardly 1% followed us out of the party into our American neo-Bolshevik organization. There are no hard numbers on this group's membership, but it was allegedly somewhere between 300 at its lowest and 1,500 at its highest. But it is the latter number that is more likely to be true, given that the Lovestone organization was present in numerous major cities across the country, and at one point absorbed the Ukrainian and Lithuanian local language sections in the early 30s after they split from the official communist movement for its sectarianism. The Lovestone group had a bi-weekly paper that was titled Revolutionary Age, but in 1932 this was changed to Workers' Age because the U.S. Post Office was threatening to stop sending it out to subscribers because of the name. Throughout the existence of Workers' Age, it faced financial struggles, but managed to stay in publication until 1941, when the Lovestoneite faction ceased its existence entirely. As previously mentioned, the Lovestoneites greatly supported united fronts, which meant they were in favor of collaboration with socialist and progressive elements of the labor movement. They attacked the theory of social fascism as delusional and nonsensical. Although they supported making alliances in the labor movement, as opposed to sectarianism, when the Comintern rapidly switched to the Popular Front tactic in the mid-1930s, the Lovestoneites were staunchly against this new term. According to Lovestone, the Popular Front, the People's Front, was a revival of class collaboration under a new name. He declared that it was a violation of Marx and Lenin, and that its future ramifications, despite the possible positive short-term effects of defending democracy against fascism, was the total destruction of the communist movement by the subordination of communist to bourgeois forces. In the People's Front illusion, he writes, "We cannot repeat too often that the evaluation of bourgeois democracy must be made realistically and therefore viewed in the light of the class conflicts of the decaying capitalist system. It is only because the Comintern failed to do so that its section in France demands the defense of declining bourgeois democracy there, that its sections in Germany and Italy demand the restoration and revitalization of their defunct capitalist democracy. It is only on this basis that the American Communist Party could make its central slogan in the last presidential election the defense of democracy, in a country where the first job of the communists and all class-conscious workers is to disillusion the masses with the virtues of the prevailing system of bourgeois democracy. In short, in practice, the People's Front policy entails not merely a postponement of the struggle, but even the abandonment of the agitation for the proletarian dictatorship for an indefinite period." While opposed to working with bourgeois forces, the Lovestoneites were fine with working with progressive labor advocates. The various branches of the communist opposition engaged in a variety of different activities, public meetings, sometimes addressed by Lovestone, Wolfe, Herberg, or some other national leader, forums, debates with rival radical groups, and the sales of the party paper were amongst the most consistent kinds of activity. Activities by oppositionists within trade unions, organizations of the unemployed, tenants' leagues, and other such groups were of great importance. Union activity meant a great deal to the Lovestoneites. In fact, Lovestone's staunch position on unions was part of the reasons he was expelled from the party in the first place. They supported working and reactionary trade unions. They considered the Comintern policy of creating red unions to be foolish and detrimental. In their view, it disconnected not just the American communists, but communists worldwide from the masses. While official communism began to mass remove their members from the unions in the late 20s and early 30s, the Lovestoneites, on the contrary, began to enter them. When unions began to expand under the New Deal in the mid-1930s, the Lovestoneites saw this as a vindication of their policy. During their time, the Lovestoneites became influential amongst the International Ladies' Garment Workers, the International Fur, the United Mine Workers in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, shoe workers' organizations in New England, the United Automobile Workers Union, and they worked in numerous other unions across the nation. Of these, the UAW and the ILGW proved to be their greatest successes. The United Automobile Workers was one of the few unions in which the Lovestoneites held national leadership, but its policy in the union was quite controversial amongst itself. Since they were essentially appointed to union leadership as fellow travelers for their anti-Stalinism and did not acquire major control of the organization, it was only in the ILGW and amongst its various local segments that they held a mass following. Their veteran trade union activist, Zimmerman, would become the manager of the Local 22 of the ILGW in 1933 after its old chairman retired to join an anarchist commune. Less than 3 months after the Lovestoneite takeover, they managed to win a general strike in New York City amongst the dressmaking industry. The success of the strike boosted the Local 22's membership to over 30,000. By 1934, the Lovestoneites held key positions within the organization. The Lovestonites tried to convince the official communists to give up dual unionism, which they refused. When they did re-enter the ILGW in the late 30s, they tried to fight the Lovestonite leadership for control. Indeed, at every step, the Lovestonites had to fight with the official communists in the labor movement. At one point, the official communists worked hand in hand with conservatives just to block a Lovestonite from attaining a leadership position. Although the Lovestonites were usually at odds with the official communists, challenging them and their policies in various places, whenever attempts were made at charging, arresting, or expelling them from unions, they always strongly denounced or attempted to prevent this from happening. Even when Ben Gold, who had been hampering and fighting them in the Furriers Union for years, was indicted, along with 25 other labor leaders, under antitrust laws, this group strongly denounced this, and argued that labor solidarity came first. But in the late 1930s, their stance on this changed, and the group worked more thoroughly to expel communists from the labor movement wherever they worked. An interesting feature of the Lovestone group was a staunch commitment to anti-racist activity in the labor movement. The Lovestone group devoted a great deal of its activity on the Negro question. They published an article titled Marxism and the Negro Question in 1935. Lovestone's pamphlet, The American Labor Movement, Its Past, Present, and Future, also, as Paul Leblanc says, quote, gave serious attention to overcoming racial differences among workers and combating racism. From 1935 to 1936, the Harlem section of the CPO, which was 90% black, published a magazine called The Negro Voice. Bertram Wolfe founded a magazine called Race, which many famous black intellectuals of the day, such as Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, and Edward Franklin Frazier, contributed to. Many of the black members of the Lovestone group would go on to play prominent roles in civil rights and labor issues, even when the top leadership abandoned communism. Despite the group's progressiveness on a race, they were quite backwards on women's issues, devoting little discussion to the question of women's rights. The Lovestone group itself was very male-oriented, and Lovestone himself was a noted misogynist. Like every communist organization ever, even the small Lovestone group was subject to splits. Not even a year after the group's founding, there was a split over the subject of unity with non-communist groupings. In 1932, there was the previously mentioned split by Ben Getlow over positions on the USSR. Not even 1 year later, a member named Herbert Zamm led a split over the subject of the CPO's relationship to the official communist movement. While Lovestone always considered the CPO to be but a fraction of the official communist movement, which would eventually rejoin, Zamm argued that the CPO needed to take a harder line and strive for the creation of a genuinely new communist party. Throughout the Lovestone group's existence, they were essentially orthodox Marxist-Leninists. The only real difference that separated them, like many other so-called communist renegades, were tactical questions. There was virtually no fundamental difference between the Lovestone group and the CPUSA. The point when the Lovestoneites began to switch their perspectives and become disillusioned with their ideas was their experiences with the official communist movement that constantly rebuffed them, but also the tragic events that occurred during the Spanish Civil War. The Lovestoneites supported the Bucharest Workers' and Peasants Bloc, which then merged with the Trotskyist Communist Left of Spain to form the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, or PUM. The Spanish Republic, which had increasingly subordinated itself to Moscow, outlawed the PUM, as well as arrested and killed its leaders. This clearly horrified the Lovestoneites, because the PUM was essentially the Spanish version of their organization. Even though they did not associate the activities of the Spanish communists with that of the Comintern as a whole experience of the 1930s only served to demoralize the Lovestoneites and have them reconsider their convictions. Robert Alexander writes, there were other factors which contributed to the change in Lovestonite ideology. One was the Lovestoneites' disillusioning experience with the Comintern after it had abandoned the third period line. Not only did the Stalinists not admit that they had ever been wrong, but they swiftly moved to a position as extreme in collaboration with non-communist elements as the third period had been extreme in sectarianism and isolation. Furthermore, the Stalinists showed no inclination to make peace with and reintegrate into their midst the communist opposition elements, either in the United States or anywhere else, which had constantly pointed out how erroneous the third period line had been. By 1937 or 1938, it had to be clear to the Lovestoneites that no matter how much the Stalinists might adopt positions similar to their own, there existed virtually no possibility of a political reconciliation between the two groups. In addition, Lovestonite domestic experiences in the United States, particularly in trade union politics, reinforced this realization. These experiences had to make it clear to the Lovestoneites that they continued to be regarded as mortal enemies by the followers of Stalin. Similarly, the Lovestoneites and Stalinists held drastically divergent positions with regard to the United States' foreign relations. The Stalinists applauded Roosevelt's moves towards supporting a general alignment against Nazi Germany, and the Lovestoneites put major emphasis on keeping the United States out of involvement in a new war. This, too, must have made any reconciliation with the Stalinists seem not only unachievable, but undesirable. By 1938, once the group adopted the name Independent Labor League of America, and by 1939, the leadership of the Lovestoneite group became committed anti-communists, and their focus became that of ejecting all communists from the labor movement. They declared themselves as democratic socialists, and still defended Marxism for some time, before they eventually dropped this too. In the end, Lovestone started working for the CIA, Bertram Wolfe joined the State Department, and Will Herberg became a Jewish theologian. He moved so far to the right, in fact, that he even denounced and attacked the civil rights movement. But this can't be said of all the Lovestoneites, especially its black members. Although the main leadership took an ultra-conservative turn later in life, and a decent amount of the group abandoned radical politics altogether, other members of the group were quite consistent in their socialist or progressive ideas, and kept fighting for labor rights and actively fought in civil rights struggles going on into the 1960s.